Today I'm sharing exclusive gameplay of my time playing Dune Awakening. Now, the devs generously flew me out last week to Funcom in Norway with the freedom to play the game in its beta state and to share with you up to an hour of my gameplay, so thanks does go to them for that. And before we jump into this, I do want to say if you're interested in checking the game out yourself, I will put a link to the Steam store in the description below so you can wishlist it and sign up for the beta test. Now, Dune Awakening is a multiplayer survival crafting game, and your first port of call is the character creation. This sets the look of your character, but also allows you to choose one of 5 roles for your character that will unlock a specific ability tree that you'll be able to make use of as you progress through the game. Soon after this, you crash land on the planet of Arrakis, learning the skills to survive this harsh environment, whether that's sipping the dew of plants to keep you hydrated, crafting healing kits, or climbing to safety. Before long, you find yourself escaping the cave system, venturing forth into the crashed ship, where you learn how to use the cutter for harvesting resources, as well as how to dodge attacks and how to sink your blade into shielded foes. Now, at this point, we're flung into the starting area where I and about 20 other players began, and this is where my first concern arises from the game. I started just a few minutes after most other players, and because of this, all the foliage that I needed to collect had already been taken by other players. Now, this isn't a problem with games that have been well established and new players coming in drips and drabs, but if hundreds of people play the game on release, they may find themselves in a similarly frustrating start, and in my opinion, it's these first 15 minutes that really matter when it comes to hooking the player. But do not worry, I have aired my concerns to them, and I hope that there is some kind of solution to this, at least for the game's starting area. Now, in my desperation, I ran to camps to collect resources, not realizing that these camps were actually enemy camps, and this was where my first true enemy encounter began. Dashing back in with my scrappy makeshift knife, I darted towards the enemies, slashing at them like a madman, which paid off, but only after being downed. However, if you self-revive before the enemy deals enough damage, you can get back up, and that's exactly what I did. Now, I really want to say melee feels fine in this game, and it does if it's one-on-one, but for me, I really started to struggle when multiple enemies were fighting me. There's no hard lock or even soft lock mechanic by design, which makes larger fights feel slightly overwhelming, but this could just be a case of me having to get used to the feel of the game, and I have to state this is just my first impressions. Now, finally, after spending about 15 minutes in the starting area, I was able to harvest the foliage to get my basic armor and build myself a pistol. Unlike the melee combat, which can feel a little overwhelming, the gunplay feels great, so much so that I decided to let the patrol spot me so that I could take on a slightly harder force, and I really enjoyed it, even if it was a little touch and go with my health at this point. Now, the combat is made even more fluid with abilities. I started out as a trooper, and as you level up, you get to dedicate skill points to certain abilities, like the grapple hook, which is fantastic for traversal, or the reduction grade, allowing you to freeze enemies in their tracks so that you can shoot them freely until they fall down. Now, you can have 3 abilities running at any point, but at the same time you can freely reassign abilities as you see fit, and if you do have enough skill points and if you find the right teacher, you can learn all of the skills regardless of what class you picked, which is great in my opinion, as you have the freedom to play however you want regardless of your start. Now, having given combat a good shot, it was time for me to build my first base, and coming from games like Satisfactory, Valheim and Enshrouded, I'll be candid, I'm left wanting more. It's not a bad system, but it's not great. Placing down a sub-fief console allows you to claim a small patch of land. This can be expanded later, but allows you to place foundations within the confines of the border so that you can build a base. The foundations snap to one another, and you can quickly and easily snap walls and ceilings to this, and the build menu UI seems overly complicated in my opinion, as you have to click through the different build types such as walls, foundations and roofing using Q and E keys, and then you have to flick through the placeables such as lights and furniture using the Z and C keys. And when it comes to building, you need to use the right mouse button to cycle between the modes, whether that's building, copying pieces, moving, repairing and dismantling. And yes, this is probably just my bias showing, given I've spent so much time in games like Satisfactory and Enshrouded, but it feels just a little unnaturally clunky for me. Now I could go on about this, but I'll save that for a later video because there's a lot more to cover when it comes to the building system and the blueprints and what I would like to see. And it does have a lot of potential. Regardless, once you have a building set up, providing you power the fuel generator and you've set up the permissions, your base is safe from raids, bar a few exceptions in the end game. But with a shelter prepped, I ventured forth slaying more foes before finding myself in a trading post. Here I could trade items, take on contracts and fly out to one of the great cities, but with little money I continued on, finding more bandit camps and an ornithopter to salvage. Unfortunately, though there are some wonderful little nooks and crannies to find between all the rocky outcrops, it does feel quite monotonous with the same enemies and such a barren environment. Now I do hope that as we venture deeper into the world that there is a little bit more variety, and again I do have to state this is the beta version of the game, so it may well change before the release. I still had fun with the combat elements and playing around with the different ability loadouts, but I am concerned if I played for hundreds of hours, it might lack the flair to play more. That being said, from my understanding, the end game is where it really starts to open up and get interesting for players. Continuing my adventure out, I soon discovered explosive grenades were particularly useful at clearing enemies, but I did end up biting just a little bit too much off, facing my first death, and I was pleasantly surprised that apart from losing a few resources, death was pretty forgiving in this game, making it worthwhile setting up respawn beacons as you travel, something which I forgot to do. So instead I returned to my base to build a blood purifier, allowing me to extract blood from future victims and turn it into drinkable water, which is actually particularly important in the game. Though food is available and has the benefit of accumulating spice, which I'll cover soon, lack of water will result in dehydration and a very quick death. And it's surprising how quickly you will dehydrate without a still suit or a water system in place. Staying out in the sun will also give you sunstroke, so sticking to the shade is best. This is only really an issue though if you're climbing the dunes or building out in the sunlight, which unfortunately I did frequently, resulting in me sapping dew every few minutes. It's not a bad system, but it can be frustrating in the early game if you're taking your time with the game. Now with my blood bags in hand, it was time to search out my first dungeon. I travelled far and wide, seeing the first sandworm breach before me under the northern lights, which I was actually very lucky to see for real whilst I was in Norway. It's surprising though how much terror the sandworms give off in the early game, and these are the small worms. Venturing out in the dunes fills you with a sense of dread, darting between the rocky outcrops. Unfortunately, we can't sandwalk at the moment in game, though this may come at a later date. So, if you venture out at your own peril. Coming across my first biolab, I loved the design, but I was almost instantly disappointed as I found dead bodies strewn in front of me. Due to the way the game is set up, if a player enters a lab before you, the enemies may already be cleared out. You'll still get the loot, which is a nice addition, but you'll be running around an empty dungeon, and this unfortunately happened to me a couple of times during my playthrough. And this was obviously because we all started at the same time, but clearing dungeons is fun. Running around empty ones, especially multiple times, not so much. Regardless, it did mean that I was able to secure my first schematic. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about the food in-game. This is used to fill your little spice meter that's at the bottom center of the screen, and once you fill it, you can use it in return for quicker ability cooldowns and also an attuned sense of the world around you. This allows you to see the enemy health bars and also spot traps, which can be particularly useful. Though I only had a few hours in the game and some of the smaller camps felt quite repetitive, I was pleasantly surprised by the variety of cave systems, cliffhanging bases, and labs available, and I do hope this continues to feel fresh after, say, 50 hours in game. However, the true game, as I mentioned a little earlier, sounds like it opens up in the Endgame, where the deep desert features an open PvP map which completely changes weekly, giving players the opportunity to make money scouting the regions and selling maps, or finding rich resource locations and bountiful labs to loot. And with the map being particularly large, it's supposedly unlikely that you'll be swamped by players, making encounters actually quite rare, but tense. And that's what really excites me, even if I do personally prefer PvE gameplay. Perhaps I'll need my own guild to venture out with for security. Returning to the base, I built my first fabricators, allowing me to craft the still suit and the particularly rare schematics that I had come across. However, you're limited to how many of these items you can craft, and you will need to find more schematics if you want to produce more of them. This is actually a great way to keep players exploring and actively encourages players to trade, fueling the in-game economy, whilst encouraging players to play around with different loadouts, allowing you to change up your playstyle. For example, this reduction belt that I've just produced allows you to maintain proportion when grappling, allowing you to slingshot yourself across the dunes with ease. And you'll also be able to find a lot more NPC traders at the larger cities, which will have goods for you to buy as well. I found a taxi to Arakin, the city of the House of Atreides, and I should mention that Dune Awakening is set in a different timeline to the one of the movies. In Dune Awakening, Paul Atreides never existed, and in its place, a war of assassins has begun between House Atreides and House Harkonnen, leaving the Fremen all but destroyed in their wake. Now, in place of this, we can fulfill contracts to secure influence to a given house, and at the end of each week, the house with the largest influence will have the option to choose a week-long server rule, such as reducing the resources needed for crafting, or perhaps disabling the shields of player bases in the deep desert. It's a really interesting idea, adding a level of political intrigue that I'm eager to explore. Now, I could talk about this further, but I'd rather save some content for a future video. There's also an interview that I'm going to have a look at editing down for you guys, so we'll save that for later, such as the gameplay that we've got with the Ornithopter, exploring base building a little bit more on the blueprint system, and even covering how it's possible to chain production facilities together. But what I will say is that from my short time with the game, I am excited to share more with you, and I'll definitely be jumping into the game on release to collect that spice. In its beta form though, it is a little rough around the edges at times, but the devs have had a lot of feedback from players, and they were very responsive to our concerns. The game is both fun and at times terrifying, and you should always fear the sandworm, because if you die to that, you will lose everything. A lesson I learned the hard way. Again, I'd like to say a big thank you to Funcom again for inviting me to Norway, and I recommend anyone interested in the game to check out the Steam link below and even sign up for the beta as it nears to launch. But as always, special thanks does go to all of our incredible supporters on Patreon, most notably our Lunar Eclipse patrons, Firefless, The Calamity, Ben, Star, and Seeker Kala, as well as our Blood Moon of the Day, which today is Papa Snoozy. Until next time, as always, Ciao for now.